Okay, so the first question is based on the idea of export processing zones. And we had responses in the exercises to the video lecture. And we had responses from places as diverse as the Philippines, Zimbabwe, Antigua and Barbuda, and Uganda and Brazil. And people said universally, these export processing zones have really a negative effect on the natural environment, especially to places that are really sensitive, like wetlands. And in the case of the Caribbean, they were ripping up mangroves, and it made the shoreline susceptible to hurricanes. And often, universally, these EPZs have holiday periods, holidays for taxes, and periods of exemptions for labor laws and environmental protections. And the sense that people had where they had put EPZs in their own regions was that when they expired, the companies often pulled out because they no longer had favorable conditions, or they expected them to pull out and just leave a swath of destruction and to leave the region not any better off than it had before they built the export processing zone. So I want, and kind of almost a de facto like looting, taking what they needed, these multinational corporations, and once they left, just left the places worse off. So my question to Professor O'Brien is, have there been attempts to successfully organize against this kind of exemption to local rules and laws, and people been able to push back in these export processing zones and organizing against the worst effects? So that would be my question.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Gifford, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just make a couple of comments before I try and address your question directly. So first of all, I think it's wonderful to have people from so many different places, because questions about export processing zones or regional trade agreements, they're kind of general questions, but they're also really specific questions, right? Because there's such a variety in different EPZs in different parts of the world. And similarly with regional trading agreements, they're not all the same. They're quite different in the areas that they cover, in the institutional structure, in what's possible in them. So it's really important that people share their experiences so we get a sense of the variety and the different things that are being done in them. So that's the first point. The second point I wanted to make is that when I think about EPZs or RTAs, I think of them or dealing with them in two different ways. One of them is kind of an inside way, and the other one is an outside way. When I say one of them is an inside way, what I mean by that is we can think about the specifics of a specific export processing zone or regional trade agreement. What's the legal structure? What's the rules around them? What's the kind of technical details of them? And then think about how we might respond to those. So inside the agreement. But the other thing that's maybe not as immediate, but is still important, is outside of those agreements, outside of those arrangements, what can be done about development strategies in general? Because I think it's important to think about EPZs and RTAs as development strategies. Right? So they're just kind of one of a series of policy tools that particular governments are using in order to try and attract investment to boost economic growth. So there, the question, I think, is kind of a broader one, which is, are there alternative development strategies that might be possible that don't rely on the exploitation of labor or the destruction of the environment? And then that's kind of a broader question about engaging with governments, about, demonstrating that, as some of the people said in the feedback, that, after 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, EPZs don't really leave you with improvement in employment or improvement in economic development, that, they haven't made the connections to local industries, and therefore trying to push governments to think about alternative ways of launching development programs. So there's both kind of the immediate, like, what do we do with these kinds of structures, but also the broader politics about rethinking the types of development that various countries are pursuing. So that's kind of a broader issue. Okay, so now more to the specific question, which was about, have there been examples of people organizing in export processing zones? So, so here again, it's really very mixed, and it very much depends on which zones we're talking about. Let me just try and pull something up here. So I'm going to try and post something in the chat. We'll see if it goes through or not. Okay. Okay, so this, if people want to pursue it, it's a little bit of an old article, but it talks about organizing in the Dominican Republic around export processing zones there, mainly around apparel companies. And that's an example of a campaign that was somewhat successful in engaging with the company, but also with kind of mobilizing workers in different export processing zones. We could look at other examples, maybe from Sri Lanka, in attempts to use the OECD guidelines to try and put pressure on home companies companies in the developed world, in host companies, to improve labor standards. So there's certainly lots of activity in different places, but as with other kind of labor capital relations, it's a very difficult challenge, and there's a number of factors that may influence success or lack of success, right? So one of them, of course, is whether the companies that are operating in these areas are well-known brands, right? Because if they're well-known brands, then it's a little bit easier to target those brands and to target the shareholders and to try and do something about the terms of employment and the working conditions. If they're not well-known brands and they're just, let's say, mass producing things for Walmart, it's much more difficult to target them and to accomplish objectives. So beyond that, I would say that there has been some, obviously there's a huge amount of effort in trying to organize in different places, but the challenges are very large, of course, because these areas are created by governments to avoid regulation, to attract investment. So you're already working uphill against the national development strategy, which is to exploit labor and exploit the environment to attract investment. So that's why I was mentioning this kind of alternative side, which is, in addition to working in the EPZs, is working on this issue of what's the development strategy of the country? What's the national development strategy? Because if the national development strategy is focused on this type of labor and environmental exploitation, then it's very difficult to change the conditions in the EPZs, because the government's committed to enforcing those conditions and using it as a form of comparative advantage. So maybe I'll stop there, Gifford, and we can open it up and see what people have to say, if they have things that they can contribute from different places where they are located.
Okay, great. Those are great examples, some nice things to begin the discussion with. Does anyone have a question to add to this conversation? Ron, go ahead.
Yeah. Actually, in the Philippines, we have 5, as I have mentioned in our chat in the program, that we have 5 government administered export processing zones and hundreds of privately administered economic zones. So since the 80s, these economic zones are are pulling the workforce for employment. It contributes employment, and at certain point, while it exploits labor, it also breeds unionization, because there are many workers who came from different areas, and they stayed in the place that near the export processing zones, and it becomes more a place that they can communicate with each other, and it's much more easier to congregate workers for organizing. But at the later part of of the operations of those export processing zones, local government authorities and also the state apparatus constrict or hinders organizing, because they saw it that it increased density during the that was during the 80s, but during the 90s and currently in these contemporary times, that global competition was really uh, intense. So the government are constricting organizing effort that prompted to establish different mechanisms toward unionizations, like what we have right now. We have a joint industrial. They cloud it in the Joint Industrial Peace Coordinating Office, meaning that state authorities plus the police and military are having a checkpoints wherein workers go in and out of the economic processing zones. And of course, you might hear in the news currently that there are rising cases of extrajudicial killings. Trade unionists are being killed here in the Philippines. It's so sad that the ILO Committee on Application of Standard did not include that in their report in the recent International Labor Conference. But I sense that the government are trying to still sustaining this kind of operations of the EPZs as a national strategy, considering that many of the factories, especially in the garment, are reproducing from the garment into something like or repurposing from garment clothing to some face mask or something that would help to revive the economy. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ramon. Yeah. Other questions, comments?
Actually, my question to Professor Brien. Would you think that sustaining this kind of operation will still be, I mean that would it lead to industrialization, considering that you don't have any local manufacturing that you can say that it's in your own. You are relying to exports, of course, input coming from the developed economy, but the production is in the developing economy like the Philippines, and of course, it's not really integrated into micro and small domestic economy. Would you think what would be the alternative development strategy that you can think that going away from this develop strategy that that benefits only the industrialized economy?
Well, Ramon, that's certainly both a very large and very difficult question to try and answer. But I think that, if we look historically, it's almost every case that we have of industrialization has taken place behind some kind of national protectionist policy, right? I can't think of any example of a country industrializing under a condition of open borders and free trade. So the kind of model that we have with EPZs, I think you've really identified, two of the major problems. So one of them is that they're usually not linking to the local economies, right? So there's no opportunity or very little opportunity for local businesses to upgrade and participate. And then the other issue, of course, is that they're so linked into the global economy and they're highly mobile that if conditions change, they can move to other places. So what that would suggest to me is that if a country was interested in upgrading its industrial structure, it would need to look at examples of countries which both are engaged in international trade and serving the international market, but are also providing support and some forms of protection to their national industry. If it's just an EPZ strategy, I think it's very difficult to kind of take that next step to upgrade your industries and to industrialize.
Okay. Other questions?
If I just may add something, I think this week we're gonna launch the chapter industrial policy, and I think the link is very strong, and it's I think the same discussion we are having also in that chapter about how the existing trade regime is actually limiting the space for industrial policy and what can be done. So I think it's a very important discussion also for the forthcoming chapter. Sorry for that.
Cheng-Li, why don't you go ahead?
Yes, thank you very much. I don't have a question, but I just want to have a little bit of comment using a little bit example of what I understand of the special economic zone in China. That's exactly what the professor was saying, actually. It's the single instrument, like as using the export processing zone as one instrument for the development of industrialization, obviously it's too weak. And I think it's have to be using other, if it's as a strategy, I think somehow have to be a little bit broad. And I have been many times been questioned that how can we actually push in the special economic zones for example, the joint ventures or for the technology transfer. Obviously, one strategy, we only have a zone for concentration on the garment industry does not really necessarily interlinked to other industries. And as well as, it does not really, it depends on the situation or depends on the facilitations from other parts. Does it really can create a cluster which can really interlink many of the, or inter-upgrade to the whole development, industrialized strategy. So I think exactly one economic zone as has been implemented. If I look at the situation in India, they also implemented very scattered in special economic zones, which in the 90s also, and it does not really create that, or does not really coordinate with other clusters, so does not at the end really create this interlinked as form as a cluster or as interlinked to the whole strategy of the industrialization. So it's difficult. In these cases, at the end, we tend to the country becoming race to the bottom to competing for the investment. So we are not really putting the conditions. We're not going to put limits. We have to push you, have a sense of the transfer of technology, or you have to integrate with our strategy, or have to be interlinked to other sectors. So at the end, we're only competing. So the cost is just we offer cheap labor, we offer free electricity or cheap water. So only for the race to the bottom for different regions. So at the end, one country have many special economic zones or export process zones, but one is competing to each other to offer more cheap labor or better, environment protections. That's it. Thanks.
And by the way, I just want to...
No, I was just going to say, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, there's lots and lots of places with cheap labor, right? Like that you can't win that competition because there's always other places with cheap labor, or there's other states that are willing to cheapen their labor somehow, right? Through taking away rights or changing working conditions or these sorts of things.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the next chapter will be, as Edward Lara just pointed out, will be on designing sustainable industrial policies, and Chen Li will be the tutor for it. So this will be continued. Other questions?
Can I have one? Just
Sure, go ahead.
I remember Professor Brien that the article of Hayun Chang, the kicking away the ladder, because there should be a level of protection for a developing economy to industrialize, like the one they did, like the one the industrialized countries did before. But given the current regime of the WTO and open economy, what protection are available? The tariff you cannot just raise tariff. You cannot. So, do we still have some level of protective measure for us to catch up the development of our own economy? For example, the developing countries like the Philippines, to be integrated in the global value chain, or maybe keep away from that. So, what your views on that?
Yeah, so I would say that there's still possibilities, and there's still things that governments can do. The difficulty, of course, is you need to have a government that's committed to that kind of economic strategy. And in your case, in the Philippines case, as you eloquently outlined, you have a government which is violently pursuing anti-worker and I would argue anti-development policies. But I think if you had other governments, there's still possibilities, maybe not in the same way that countries like Canada or the United States develop, but there's still possibilities of providing some supports to local industries. And well, you said you're going to have a session on industrial policy, so I'll let the experts on industrial policy talk about that. But I would say from my understanding of the operation of international institutions, that there's always some space around the margins to play around with different rules and to think about different ways of doing things and to exploit different types of openings. Now, as time goes on, you have to be creative about what those might be. But I would say that those possibilities are still there, but different from the way that they were 40 years ago, 50 years ago.
Okay, before we move on to the next question, are there any other questions from any of you here? Lara? No.
So there is something on the chat from Sarvasar.
Okay, yeah, I'll read this. So this is from Sarvaswar. I'll read this. So he says, it's been observed that despite lots of concessions, the majority of special economic zones are closed, but lands are in the eyes of the developers. How does the closure of SC, or the special economic zones, affect workers and land related to displacement due to land acquisition on other informal workers?
So I certainly don't have the answer to that question. And I'm not even familiar all that much with the problem. So I'm wondering if maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the problem and the issue that you're concerned about.
So Sarvaswar, how's your connection? Could you take the floor and ask it more directly?
Yeah, actually, I am based at Ahmedabad. So there are actually a number of special economic zones, but I have not studied them. But from different sources, I come to know that majority of them they are closed. So my point is there any provision? Because earlier, we have lot of labor laws that can't close the industries, without giving notices and all. But from studies, I come to know that special economic zones are, they devoid of all kind of laws. Even they don't follow the constitutions also. This is what I don't know. I'm not sure. So my point is, and most of these SEZs are located in the coastal zones. Gujarat, they have a 1600-kilometer coastal zones. So the lands are, they are acquired for a particular purpose, but after close down, those land has been, are being used for other purposes. So that affect the people whose lands were acquired. So in that context, I just wanted to know what will be the impact on the workers, those who are working in the SEZ, and others nearby, means those who were depending on those land for livelihood that went to these SEZs. But I have no idea per se.
Well, academics are always looking for research questions. So I think maybe you've just developed or identified something that there could be some more research on. So if I get you correctly, you're basically looking at the question of what happens to these lands after they're closed, and who benefits from it, and what happens to the local populations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Means majority of them, there may be fish vendors, fish laborers. I'm talking about the SEZ that are located to the coast. Maybe so other kind of workers will be there in other areas.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question.
Thank you.
Why don't we move on to my second question? And unfortunately, my second question has a lot of overlap with the first question, but perhaps I was hoping that the economic processing zones would be a little more specific, and this one would be a little bit more general and a little bit more theoretical. But here's the second question. The regional trade agreements have also had a negative effect, of course, on workers and environmental protections because of the focus on promotion of investments, foreign direct investments, all those kinds of things, international intellectual property rights. And somebody made the really astute point of just supply chain integration. So despite the promises of job creation, the result has mostly been an ever greater reliance on labor-intensive forms of production and low wages. Now, in the level of debate, have labor or progressive social forces been able to put pressure on any of these regional trade agreements? Has there been success for labor or, as I said, other progressive forces to steer it in a different direction? And again, a little bit of overlap with the previous question, but have there been successes, or have there been inspiring attempts to do this?
Okay, thanks a lot, Gifford. Okay, so again, like back to the EPZs, there's such diversity in what these regional trading agreements are, right? So we have some which have extremely elaborate institutional structures, and some which have a explicit political nature, and then we have others which have very weak institutions and rejection of any kind of social dimension. So I think we really have to look at the particular agreement that we're talking about. But let me just mention a couple and the kind of sometimes strange politics operating around them. Okay, so we do have some agreements which have social dimensions, right? So in the case of Latin America and Mercosur, they have a social and labor declaration which outlines particular labor principles that the various states are supposed to be committed to. In the case of the European Union, you have kind of minimal labor standards and employment standards that people within the EU have to adhere to. You have some rules about the necessity of consulting with and informing workers about particular economic strategies that companies are going to undertake. And from that kind of low base, other countries can regulate more. I mean, interestingly, those provisions which are not overly generous, but still they're a floor to work under. The Conservative government in the United Kingdom is enthusiastic about getting away from those conditions. And if any of you have followed the debate about Britain leaving the European Union, one of the reasons that those who wanted to leave cite often is their ability to set their own standards, right? And part of that is I think is a cover or a code for lowering labor standards and lowering social standards. So in that case, there was a regional agreement which probably has or will have higher standards than we will probably see in the UK in the next decade or 2 decades as they try and lower standards. If we shift our attention to another region, to the region that Gifford and I are in, North America. So there, and this is interesting because I noticed, Gifford, in your question, you asked about progressive social forces. So in the renegotiation of the NAFTA agreement, under Donald Trump, we have social forces that are not necessarily progressive, but have still made changes to North American trading arrangements that in some cases are labor friendly, but it didn't necessarily come from the left of the political spectrum. It came from the right of the political spectrum. So for example, under the old trading agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement, we had provisions where companies could sue governments over various environmental standards or labor standards. In the new agreement, that has been removed. But also in the new North American agreement, we see, I think we see kind of tensions where workers' interests can be put against each other. So there's a number of labor provisions that were added to the new agreement, but those provisions are kind of primarily aimed by the United States at Mexico, right? Where Mexico has to enforce its labor legislation more or face certain consequences. And so here it gets complicated as in these agreements about how new standards might be implemented and whether they're just targeting particular parts or particular countries, if it's just kind of more wealthy countries targeting developing countries, or if it is a genuine attempt to try and raise everybody's standards. So again, it varies in these different areas. There have been in some areas where, let's say, the regional integration goal is more ambitious. There have been attempts, we'll say, let's say in Europe and in South America and to some extent in North America, to bolster the social dimension, but it's not without complications. There are kind of all sorts of issues that run through those attempts. And then you'll have other areas, let's say like ASEAN in Southeast Asia, where the labor dimension really isn't part of what those regional agreements are. They might talk about labor issues in terms of human resource development, but not in terms of social standards or labor rights, because those institutions don't have a vision for kind of the social dimension of trade. So to kind of answer the question, I would say it varies a lot. We have seen some kind of pitched battles and political struggles in some of the regions where there have been maybe some limited social standards. But it's again, like other things, it's an uphill struggle, and it raises some issues about who benefits and who doesn't benefit from those initiatives.
Okay, great. Excellent overview. Anyone have any questions?
Or comments?
Well, not seeing anyone right away. I'd like to get your
Gifford,
perspective.
my hand is up.
Go ahead, please speak. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Brien, for your submission. I just want to give the experience of Africa. As you know, currently, the countries recently signed the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. However, in 2018, the National Nigerian Labour Congress actually asked their president not to assent to that trade agreement. Some of the arguments was that it is opening up the space for foreign companies to actually come and trade in Africa, because one of the provisions of the trade agreement is that, for instance, if Kenya enters into a bilateral agreement with the US and has already signed the current free trade agreement for Africa, then by extension, some of the privileges given to African countries will have to be extended to USA. So this was actually a gray area. And then there was also the debate of how do you determine the country of origin, especially when it comes to a product which is being sold within Africa. What if you have these EPZs, let's assume in Uganda, but that EPZ is actually manned by China, for example, and they bring products through Uganda, will it still hold as a country of origin, even though it has been exported into Uganda, then used to make, let's say, value addition for some of the materials to be sold within the African market? Does it still stand as country of origin from Uganda or from China? So those are areas we're still seeing is going to have a lot of debates, even though also the issues of labor are not clearly stipulated in the trade agreements, although they talk about free labor movement, but in terms of labor rights, that does not come out clearly. So we're still seeing a challenge of, because it becomes suspicious if the 54 countries are supposed to be signing this trade agreement, but countries like US, UK, and even China are struggling to have a bilateral agreement with countries like Kenya, among others. What is going to be the implication for the general free trade agreement for all the African countries? That is something we're still questioning ourselves. And what is the motive, either for EU, UK, or China to go bilateral with the countries who are already part of the signatory to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? I thought I would just share that.
Yeah, I think that's great. Thanks for that. And I think it raises an important point, which is when we look at trade agreements, we have kind of a dizzying number of trade agreements. And certainly countries like the United States, in some ways prefer bilateral trade agreements because they can exert more pressure. You know, if it's the United States negotiating with an individual country, that individual country is in a much weaker bargaining position. So whether it's the United States or the European Union or China, I mean, any large country has much more advantage if it's just negotiating in a bilateral agreement. And oftentimes what a country like the United States will do is they will try and get particular types of provisions in bilateral agreements that they haven't been able to get in regional agreements. And then once they get a particular country to agree to it, then they try and get that generalized to more and more countries. So I think that the caution and the skepticism that you express is well warranted to think about how these regional agreements, let's say in Africa, what kinds of implications it has for the individual countries and the large economic powers outside of the region. I think, as you said, the details become really, really important on things like rules of origin as to what the impact is going to be.
Okay, any other questions? Well, I was going to ask about, I was following the the new NAFTA agreement, not as closely as I should have been, but initially the largest American environmental group, the Sierra Club, was opposed to it because they noticed, and I don't know if this made it into the final agreement, that there was a kind of a continuation of the investor-state dispute settlement situation for Mexican oil. And because, they still were looking for the Mexican oil production and being able to, the big multinational like ExxonMobil and Chevron, being able to sue Mexico should the Mexican government make claims about the environmental destruction. Do you know if that made that into the final agreement?
Yes, it did. And that's a really good example of how particular areas of the agreement can be carved out to suit particular interests. So obviously, not obviously, but the United States has a very large interest in the Mexican oil industry. So the agreement continues the privileged access of the United States to that oil and locks in rules which make it very difficult for the Mexican government to, for example, nationalize the oil industry or enact particular rules that would benefit Mexicans if it interferes with the profits of oil companies, primarily based in the United States, but I'm sure there's some from Canada as well operating in Mexico. So so that's still there. It kind of reflects, I think, the power dynamics of the negotiations, right? Of whose interests were being represented in these negotiations. And of course, one of the problems for unions and for workers is that these negotiations are negotiated by trade ministries, right? And they reflect the interests of the trade ministers. They do not reflect the interests of other ministries within the country, whether it's the labor ministry or the health ministry or the environmental ministry. They're mainly structured to facilitate the movement of capital across state borders. So it becomes a big struggle. And one of the things when we try and evaluate these agreements is it is very important to look at what do they say about workers' rights? Are there provisions for the protection of workers' rights, or are there provisions for the protection of the environment? But also, the balance of the agreement, what are kind of the other types of structures? So I think it's Everline. I don't know if I pronounced your name right, but the point that you make about rules of origin are really important. Or as Gifford was saying, this investor state dispute mechanism, if that is in it or that's out of it. It's not explicitly about labor standards, but it is about restricting the ability of governments to make public policy that they believe is in the interest of their citizens. So if we want to evaluate these agreements, we look both at the labor and environmental provisions, but also all the other things in the agreement that help investors achieve their goals at the cost of the autonomy of the public policy process in the various states.
Thank you. Yeah, great. Other questions, comments, or how about Susan? Or Suzanne, go ahead.
Hi. I was just wondering what makes countries still to work or to want contracts with countries that are stronger than them, that will like suppress them somehow, that will, I don't know, somehow give them a hard time. I mean, some years ago, maybe, okay, they were these hopes, but I mean, they must have understood that usually they will lose somehow. Why do they still do that? Why don't they try to make contracts with countries that are on the same level? Or I don't know.
Yeah, okay. So I think, well, there's a couple of explanations. So one is here, I think we get the, what's similar between the RTAs and the EPZs, which is that they're both mechanisms for trying to attract investment, right? So why does Mexico enter into NAFTA? Mexico is in a much weaker position, but it wants those legal structures so it has guaranteed access into the American market so that American companies and European companies will come and invest in Mexico and produce in Mexico and then export into the United States. The concern is if they don't have that agreement, then things that are being made in Mexico, they don't have guaranteed access to the American market. So even if it's a bad deal, they still think it's a better deal than no deal because their strategy is based on getting, Ford and Volkswagen and whoever to come and produce in Mexico to export into the United States. Even a country like where I live in Canada, we have, before there was the North American Free Trade Agreement, there was the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. And that was undertaken because Canadian politicians and Canadian businesses wanted guaranteed access to the American market. They were concerned about protectionism. So depending on which region you're looking at, the RTAs are really just about attracting investment. And the more you need investment, the more desperate you are to enter into an RTA or even a bilateral agreement. You may join a bilateral agreement which isn't that good, but you perceive it to be better than being on the outside, not being part of that market. Even if we're talking about the African free trade agreement, part of it is about, of course, increasing economic opportunity in Africa and having different firms in Africa having a larger market for them. But the other part also is about trying to create an investment area that is very, very large that hopefully will attract more foreign investment.
Great. Everline, speaking of Africa, could you go ahead? And Everline, where are you based?
I'm actually based in Uganda. Yeah, but I work with PSI, so I'm in charge of East and West Africa. So I have a bit of knowledge of the terrain of some parts of Africa. Now, I think my interest is when you talk about bilateral agreements, and I wanted to bring the case of, for instance, Kenya and Uganda and Kenya and the US. If really it is about accessing American markets, how much is the value addition in terms of products that are being exported from Kenya to the US? It doesn't make a lot of sense. Because one, we have that asymmetry in terms of intellectual property rights and even technology transfer that would actually give Africans that ability to improve and even add value to their products, to be able to have, we cannot say a perfect play, but equitable play in terms of accessing those markets. Because we were just trying to do the mathematics. Even if Kenya entered into bilateral agreement with the USA, what will be the amount or the value of their export to the US market? It is something which is still questionable. So sometimes I have this feeling it's not more about access to either the American market or EU market, but it's also about either EU or US accessing the raw materials that they really need for their products. So it is more for, we gain more from them because we appreciate the fact that we cannot run away from the history. From the 19th century, when they got a number of African slaves to go and work in the sugarcane plantation to expand access, that still for me rings a lot of bell. So every time we talk about accessing EU market or UK market by African countries, for me it is quite paradoxical because you do not have the ability, especially in terms of value addition, for us to compete equitably in some of these developed countries. So that is just my take.
Yeah, if I can just respond to that really quickly, I think that's a really good point. I guess what I'm not familiar with the Kenyan economy and its features, so you would know much more about that than I do. My guess would be that there's particular commercial interests in Kenya which are concerned about market access. Now, those commercial interests, might be in conflict with a general Kenyan development policy. So there may be, and you can tell me which ones maybe it's cut flowers, maybe it's other things. So for them, access is important, and it doesn't really matter, what the impacts are on the other parts of the Kenyan economy. So I guess the other thing I should have said is, these agreements reflect specific commercial interests in the countries that are negotiating them, and they may not, and often do not, reflect the general interest of the country in development, but they do secure the interests of some parts of the economy, and often they may be, natural resourcing parts of the economy, and not the ones that would lead to longer term development.
If I may just have a follow-up question to that, Robert, to what extent are these agreements, do we see a pattern? Who really pushes for those? I'm from Albania, and if I take my own country, if the US is asking for such an agreement, it will be just almost sold politically as a great achievement of the government without any kind of consideration. How useful is this for the country, or how is it happening? Because it's used politically. Unfortunately, I take Susanna's point, but unfortunately, in many parts of the world, the free trade rhetoric and arguments and, engaging in trade with the big powers is sold as a victory, political victory in the country. So I'm just wondering whether that's also part of the explanation, at least for some countries, small countries such as my own.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's each of these countries has its own political dynamics, and it seems correct to me that in certain countries that can be sold as being a modernizing project, or as cementing relationships with particular powers, as well as solidifying the commercial and financial interests of particular parts of the society, right? Because there are parts of various countries that will benefit from these trade agreements. The question is it bringing kind of general benefits to the population, or is it just benefiting particular sectors? So in my country, for example, in Canada, then the oil and gas sector wants access to the American market, and there's some manufacturing parts that want access, but then there's other parts that don't, and that lose out on it. Some of the kind of dairy farmers, for example, lose out on free trade with the United States. So, it is part of the domestic politics of the various countries that are involved in it.
And perhaps as a last comment, Everline does say, what's the link between debts and grant? And I think that's going to be business impact analysis, free trade agreements. Or BIA, I'm not familiar with. But so his question is, what's the link between these agreements and debts and grants? And maybe that's also kind of following along with what Elira said about why would a country, perhaps it has a lot of financial access to investment in some capital or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think, also what happens is you have, in the negotiation of trade agreements, you have what is negotiated at the table on the specific trade agreement, and then you have the negotiations that take place outside of the trade agreement, but are still part of the trade, part of the process. In other words, that countries may be looking for specific concessions that aren't necessarily in the trade agreement itself, but may have to do with delivering grants or rolling over debt or things like that. And certainly for countries that are heavily indebted, trade agreements, the hope is that they will bring investment, right? Badly needed funds into the country.
Okay, so we might have time for one more question. We're kind of coming close to an hour. Does anyone have a final question? If not, perhaps we could just kind of wrap up here. Ramon, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if we still have more time to discuss, but as we are looking also in the historical perspective of trade, for me, it is also better to look on some of the successes wherein labor has a place in trying to come up with an alternative and change the course of the direction of the free trade. So wherein the movement or the progressive or social movement would inspire on that kind of sense of countering the course of free trade or offering more of something like a alternative social order or something. Well, just hoping that there's something that we can be inspired as a labor movement.
Robert, any final comments? I think we're out of time. Would you like to wrap up? Just maybe respond to Ramon and we'll finish right here.
Well, I mean, I think if we, look at the history of trade, we see that it's there are instances of mutually beneficial trade, but there's also many instances of the use of violence and force to create particular types of trading relations. So I think, your aspiration, Ramon, is exactly what we should be pursuing, is to try and identify those areas where these economic activities are mutually beneficial. And there are, of course, possibilities. So you mentioned, for example, South-South trade, right, which might provide some opportunities, but then also the roles of national governments to try and advance policies that benefit the general population. And part of what can be done is, by launching these critiques and demonstrating like what are the shortcomings of EPZs, right? Because all of these claims are made that they're going to bring economic growth, they're going to bring economic development. And by showing that this isn't the case, I think it puts pressure on governments to look in other places and look for other types of development models.
Thank you. I think nice way to wrap up. So I want to thank Robert for being with us today, and I really appreciate all of you for being here. So I think we'll wrap up here, and thanks again. And remember, tomorrow we'll have another workshop with Sebastian Herrero, so talking about the importance of regional trade for development. So we'll continue this discussion tomorrow. Please register and join us. And thanks again, and see you all later.